Earlier this year, Toni Morrison said something that changed me. After delivering the second of her 6 Harvard lectures, someone asked her a simple question. Why literature? You know the formula, she said. There's data, which becomes information, which becomes knowledge. But the step after that is wisdom. Neither one of those first 3 is sufficient. Literature, she continued, has always been the place to go for me because it's indeterminate and it's provocative and it can be beautiful. I have been calling myself a data artist for a while now. I've never been sure what it means. We live in a moment when data is fetishized. Show me the data, we say. But data for data's sake, numbers for the sake of quantification, that is a stillborn form of knowledge production. And I participate in it too. What about wisdom? It seems to me that our best artists, our best intellectuals, they work at their craft without having all the answers. They work at their craft by asking questions that they don't have the answers to. It's not "this is what I believe," Morrison says, because that would not be a book. It would be a tract. A book is, this may be what I believe, but suppose I'm wrong. What could it be? Or, I don't know what it is, but I'm interested in finding out what it might mean to me as well as to other people. I think data art at its best comes from a similar place. Just as the best novels don't have a singular point, some visualizations live in a space, a terrain. They are traversing the landscape of a question, trying to catch a glimpse of some fleeting thing. Morrison says her work grows from an idea that becomes a question I don't have any answers to. I identify with that a lot. I'm not sure I've ever known I was starting a project until I was sitting in front of the screen, completely bewildered. So what is the work data visualization does? What does it help us see? Perhaps one way of approaching that question is to go back in time. The year is 1899. W.E.B. Du Bois, the renowned sociologist, had just finished a series of charts for the Paris Exposition of 1900. In collaboration with his students at Atlanta University, he had set out to map the contours of the color line in Georgia. He was known by many in his day to, quote, treat the facts he obtained with the delicacy of an artist. And it showed. As you can see, the statistical diagrams Du Bois produced were remarkably creative in both form and content. They set out to map space, to chart populations, and to sketch out a brief portrait of Black life in a time of profound vulnerability. Alex Wehelier wrote a brilliant essay last year about some of these diagrammatics and about the visual work of W.E.B. Du Bois more broadly. He asked us to think about the abstract power relations that Du Bois was attempting to visualize, particularly with regard to Blackness as an object of knowledge. Wehelier writes, by giving shape to the largely invisible forces of power that hierarchically determined who properly inhabits the space of the human and who does not, Du Bois spatialized physical characteristics of a society structured in dominance, right? So a society structured in dominance. The United States still is and may forever be a society structured in dominance. So for us, people who spend our time visualizing data, working with information, hopefully striving towards something resembling wisdom, what are the narrative spaces that might animate or open up or arrogate the abstract and in many cases muted and stubborn relations of power that structure this society? Put differently, how might we spatialize in order to better understand the socio-historical moment in which we live? I'm not sure I have an answer, but I try to make work that grapples with this question. What does the American landscape look like? If we zoom all the way out, how might we see its composite parts? How do we chart its uneven geographies? In 1790, the United States passed something called the Naturalization Act. It declared free white persons as being eligible for citizenship. 1790 was also the year of the first census, a census that produced some of the first American data. If you look closely, you'll see that it was concerned with one thing: counting everyone in the country according to race, class, and gender. It also produced some of the earliest information about American enslavement at the national level. In 1850, the census added a slave schedule and the category mulatto. The names and life worlds of human beings were again reduced to numerical values. Over the years, other categories appear and disappear. Quadroon, octoroon, Hindu. One of the first projects I ever made simply looked at the race question on every US census, since the first one in 1790. How had racial categories changed over time? If the subject of the dream is the dreamer, what does the question say about the asker? If one were to write the history of the database, specifically as it traveled through the womb of settler colonialism and slavery, where would one start? The technology of the ledger, the slave schedule, the census, the spreadsheet, these are all forms of counting analogous to the database, something that stores relational data and often implies relations of power. Or maybe you start with finance. What is the relationship between the present-day stock market, the kind that has for all intents and purposes annihilated time, and the market of human stock that constellated this country in places like Natchez, Mississippi, near a clearing and a fork in the road? Or fast forward 150 years, from the age of enslavement to the age of the drone. How did we go from a ledger of human stock to a database of human targets? What are the through lines in terms of landscape, geography, racialization, and surveillance? Simone Brown connects a lot of these dots and poses some important questions about narrative in her recent book, Dark Matters. Drawing a line through panopticism, she contends that the narrative of modern carcerality should begin not with the panopticon, but with the slave ship, as it was a mobile, sea-going prison at a time when the modern prison had not yet been established on land. For me, the first prison I ever saw with my own eyes was San Quentin. It was about 20 minutes from my parents' house growing up. Its stunning panoramic views, along with some of the folks I met inside, got me thinking about landscape and geography and what it would mean to visualize all of these spaces of exception at once. How do you see something as sprawling as the prison industrial complex? What does mass incarceration mean visually? If we were to zoom all the way out and focus only on these spaces of exception, what would that landscape look like? At the time these questions became salient for me, I was lucky enough to be in Jer Thorpe's course at NYU. Working with him introduced me to the world of scripts and APIs, and before long I was scraping websites for prison data. There's an organization, the Prison Policy Initiative, that keeps meticulous records on where people are counted in the census, where incarcerated people are counted in the census. They do this to understand and hopefully end prison-based gerrymandering, where tax dollars flow from the places prisons are located rather than the towns prisoners come from. As a result, they have precise location data for every prison, jail, or detention center in the United States. As with most projects, the first thing I did was dig into their data and make a map. But in a country with as many carceral spaces as ours, a map doesn't exactly tell you much. Okay, there's a shitload of prisons. What else? It turns out if you look at the data closely, you can pull out things like population, type of prison, latitude and longitude. So in Jer's course, we wrote a script that would just hit the Google Maps API over and over, downloading an image from each location and cycling through these data points. Before long, I had a folder full of photographs, 5,393 of them. What does the geography of incarceration in the United States look like? Here's one way to answer that question. In a recent series of essays, Trevor Paglen, the artist and geographer, lays out what he thinks photography has become in the age of seeing machines. beginning from the premise that despite Instagram, despite Snapchat, despite the flood of real-time photos uploaded to Facebook or Twitter, the majority of photographs being taken today are images made by machines for other machines to see. That is a crazy idea for me to wrap my head around, right? The idea that most photos taken today will never be seen by a human eye. To explain this, he uses the example of automated license plate readers, persistent drone cameras, data feeds from clandestine spy satellites. I think about a script, Paglin says, as the basic function of an imaging system. Its style of seeing and the immediate relationships between seer and seen it produces, the obvious ways in which a seeing machine sculpts the world. As someone who writes scripts, specifically computer scripts designed to capture digital images, I find this way of thinking about seeing quite useful. What does it mean for a machine to want to see something? Who writes the code for that machine? What purpose does it serve? For me, what does it mean to represent carceral space, spaces designed to cage human beings, spaces that disproportionately cage human bodies racialized as black, as a landscape free of human form? I would argue that some of these landscapes are actually not free of human form. While a lot of my work is concerned with zooming all the way out, you can certainly see something when you zoom all the way in. In this case, the silhouettes of the people being warehoused. This is ADX Florence in Colorado. I want to linger here for a moment on the notion of silhouettes. What can be seen in a shadow? What can be gleaned from negative space? If all one has is the outlines of a thing unsaid, does that constitute data worth visualizing? In her seminal essay, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, Toni Morrison says it plain. We can agree, I think, that invisible things are not necessarily not there, that a void may be empty but not be a vacuum. In addition, certain absences are so stressed, so ornate, so planned, they call attention to themselves, arrest us with intentionality and purpose, like neighborhoods that are defined by the population held away from them. Morrison describes her endeavor in Unspeakable Things as a search, in other words, for the ghost in the machine. Around the time I made Prison Map, I started thinking more about drone geographies. What are the parts of the relational landscape that I don't have to see? Right? Most of the time, this is me, walking down the street on my phone, sending somebody a snap, scrolling through Instagram. I could not be further from the wars being carried out in my name. One of the things I fundamentally believe is in meeting people where they are. So if this is where I am, on my phone, on my screen, how can I make something that meets me here? What if every time there was a drone strike, I got a little notification? Would that allow me to plug in to bring the war just a little bit closer to home? A few years ago, I decided I would make an iPhone app that would track US drone strikes. For me, someone who had no sense of the contours of these covert operations, what does that geography look like? The app was super simple. It would literally just ping your phone every time one of these drone strikes was reported in the news. The question I couldn't answer, and the one that wouldn't leave, is this: do we really want to be as connected to our foreign policy as we are to our smartphones? The hypothesis, of course, was no. Definitely not, right? Like, who wants to receive these alerts? Why would anyone want their phone to buzz and be like, oh, it's my friend texting me, and instead it's news of 6 people dying? No, why? But I was interested in pursuing that question. What would it mean to have a different kind of relationship to data about secret networked war? At this point, the app kind of took on a life of its own. Apple was super excited about it, so they rejected it, now a total of 11 times, for being excessively crude or objectionable content. And then the fact I think that people couldn't download it probably made them want to download it more. And then after removing all references to the word drone, it was in the App Store for a little more than a year. I think something like 50,000 people still have it on their phones, until it was rejected again, twice, and then the story became about Apple and journalism and censorship, and certainly not about people or policy or drones. But at its core was a very simple question. How do I see what's on the other side of these missiles? Who are the people being burned in their cars? Who are the girls named Nabila who draw pictures of their homes with drones above them? Of all the things I choose to get notified about in real time, I don't feel like news is particularly controversial. But I've continued the project in other forms. On Twitter as DroneStream, and as an API, which I would encourage you to use, and now with some journalists at a place called The Intercept. I went up from being a person curious about the contours of covert war to working on a year-long investigation called the Drone Papers, in which a whistleblower of conscience came forward with classified documents about how this entire relational geography clicks together. It was the most complete picture I had ever seen of what's on the other side of the secrecy. And among the revelations that struck me most were how ominous a phone app about drone strikes may have been. I called the app Metadata, which for many was a banal name, but I chose it because there really isn't information about most of these drone strikes. The historical archive I was assembling is essentially metadata about English language news reports, right? Most of the time, if you read these articles, you'll get a body count, maybe the name of a province, maybe a city, maybe a number of missiles, but for the most part, there's no data to speak of. There's no narrative to speak of. Thanks to this whistleblower, however, we now know how central phones are to this entire choreography. When someone is being targeted for a drone strike, the missile isn't being fired at that person. It's being fired at their phone. Through a complex process of spoofing cell towers and tricking a phone into thinking the drone is, say, AT&T, American operators are able to triangulate a person's location, lock onto it, and then fire a missile at whoever is holding that phone. Talk about a ghost in the machine. We even have pictures of what the geolocation watch list looks like. As with many databases, people are reduced to numbers in this one as well. The primary way they are listed is by IMEI and IMSI, which are the serial numbers in your phone. We also have a map of where the drones take off from, as well as linguistic revelations. Human targets are called objectives. If an objective is killed, they're called a jackpot. If the phone explodes, it's called a touchdown. If anyone else is killed, they are called EKIA, or enemies killed in action. Most of these enemies are people whose identities the United States does not know. Over a 5-month period in Afghanistan, for example, during a campaign called Haymaker, nearly 9 out of every 10 US drone strikes were not the intended target. So thanks to this whistleblower, the metadata app now has a double meaning. It is both metadata about drone strikes, and it's the completion of a feedback loop, since telephone metadata is what's used for drone targeting. When a drone explodes a phone in Pakistan, Yemen, or Somalia, you get a little notification. Just as the missile seems to come out of nowhere, so too does the news of a war far away. Working at The Intercept has also given me some other really awesome opportunities. I've been able to do more work around satellites and scripting. This is a preview of something I'm working on right now, which is looking at the space of the entire US-Mexico border. It is composed of about 100,000 images, all downloaded from the Google Maps API and then programmatically stitched together. Its tentative title is Best of Luck with the Wall. And for Laura Poitras's show at the Whitney, I was able to go out to Creech Air Force Base and actually film some of the drones in flight. And I will never be able to forget the sound. Trevor Paglin's work has made its mark on many of the things I do. He was photographing the drones at Creech basically since they started flying there. His work with Laura on Citizen 4 helped us see the landscapes that make up the archipelago of our global surveillance network. And he wrote a book about the National Security Agency before Edward Snowden made it a household name. His metaphor of blank spots on the map pushed me down a few different rabbit holes. One of them was simply this. If it is materially impossible to make the surface of the Earth disappear, and we live in an age of satellites, which are really just cameras in space taking landscape photographs, an age where nearly everywhere is browsable in high definition via Google Earth, where are the places that have been removed from the digital archive or abstracted from the digital archive? What do they look like? It turns out there aren't many digitally secret places in the United States, at least not as many places with as creative or as obvious a redaction method as in the Netherlands. These images are from an artist named Mishke Henner, which he downloaded from Google Earth for a collection of his called Dutch Landscapes. And Ingrid Burrington is also making some really cool prototypes of different ways of seeing satellite imagery. But I was curious to at least look, right? So using a similar script as the one from Prison Map, I decided to take a snapshot of every known US military installation around the world. For a military as ubiquitous as this one, how would you measure its footprint? Once again, I started with a map and then ran a script and then began compiling a folder full of images. This is Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands. This is Guantanamo. This is Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. Naval Communications Station Holt in Australia. Harvey Point in North Carolina. This is actually where the fake Osama bin Laden compound was built. As you can see, I think this was on Bing. Vocal Air Base in the Netherlands. This is how it appears on Google. This is how it appears on Bing. Manda Bay, Kenya. This is where a lot of special operations happen. Niamey, Niger. This is where a lot of surveillance drones happen, drones take off from in West Africa. Shabelle, Djibouti. This is where most of the lethal operations, drones that actually fire missiles, take off from for operations in Yemen or in Somalia. This is the new secret drone base in Somalia outside of Kismayo. And this is the secret unacknowledged CIA drone base in Saudi Arabia, which a few years ago someone found on public satellite imagery. Also, if you pull this up on Google Maps, someone, I think, accidentally geotagged some photos from the area. So these are all part of the relational geography that make up American foreign policy in 2016. What are some of the domestic equivalents? How have the tentacles of the war on terror constructed the American landscape at home? Right after 9/11, parts of the New York City Police Department began imagining itself as an intelligence agency, dispatching plainclothes detectives into communities of color all over Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and beyond. Known as the Demographics Unit, their mission was to map entire communities of people and identify what it called ethnic hotspots, primarily targeting Muslims from 29 so-called ancestries of interest, most of which were just country names, one of which at the bottom was curiously American Black Muslim. The Demographics Unit created detailed files on the places where people ate, prayed, and shopped. Officers would walk into businesses, asking the store clerks questions. These are businesses like bodegas, restaurants, bookshops. Others would park outside and take pictures. So I started collecting some of their photographs. Most of them are quite banal. Everyday people doing everyday things. Others look like the all-seeing eye of Google Street View. The front of a business, a car pulling out of a parking spot, a man mid-stride walking past a mosque. All of these images were pulled from a trove of leaked documents given to the Associated Press in 2011. They now live on a website called profiling.is, which is meant to explore the visual vernacular of NYPD surveillance in the post-9/11 era. The Demographics Unit, though it was active for 9 years, is said to have never generated a single lead. Other parts of the American landscape that I've spent time tracing include the institution of policing more broadly. In the years since Oscar Grant was shot by Johannes Messerly on a BART platform in East Oakland, videos of peace officers executing unarmed people of color seem to surface almost every week. Harkening back to the moment of Rodney King, I can remember watching the Oscar Grant video, having shopped at the grocery store at which he was a butcher, having lived a few avenues from Fruitvale Station, and thinking that something about the way that video was circulating represented a shift in our media landscape. Until recently, the names and narratives of people killed by American police officers were relatively local knowledges. Everyone remembers that one moment from their childhood or from their neighborhood, but by and large, there was no centralized repository where this catalog of violence lived. Now, journalistic institutions are competing over who can do it best. The proliferation of phones, those with cameras and internet connections, has meant that what was already happening in Black and brown communities across the United States, routine police violence, quotidian street harassment, the Michael Slager planting of tasers, could enter the living rooms and social media feeds of folks who didn't live there as well. And visual evidence travels. The never-ending loop of Eric Garner's breath being taken away from him on camera, the sound of his voice diminishing, these things shake people to their core. They make folks shut down cities. For me, the phone as a site of intimacy, of solidarity, of unsettling news, of potential empathy, is as important as the phone as bearer of information. Sure, it gives us what Junot Diaz calls news of the world, but it also gives us our family, ephemerality, pictures of our loved ones, sexts. My phone holds the only image of my grandmother in the days before she passed. Thinking about these themes and about what it would mean to let an archive speak, I made an app that would do a similar thing as the drone app, but for police violence. It's called Archives and Absences. It's meant to visualize the landscape of police brutality in the United States. It sends you an alert every time the police end someone's life in the US. When Mike Brown's body began circulating at light speed from that spot on Canfield Drive to the phones we all keep in our pockets, something more than a media moment was happening. An organizing movement was coalescing. Folks at Blackbird, folks at BLM, folks not in traditional nonprofit organizations were standing in the streets and demanding an end to something that has been happening for a very long time. And part of me wanted to make something useful, but part of me could do nothing but listen. And then I read something that stopped me in my tracks. In thinking about what I wanted to say today, I thought a lot about negative space, the outlines of a thing unknowable or unsaid. I thought about Morrison's unspeakable things, and her search for the ghost in the machine. I thought about Saidiya Hartman's work, particularly her choice at the beginning of Scenes of Subjection to not reproduce Frederick Douglass's account of the beating of Aunt Hester. What does the choice to not represent something have to teach us in the age of social media? I think about that unsettling moment that happens all too often, when someone's life has just been taken, perhaps in public, perhaps by a police officer, and suddenly here they are, circulating through your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed on autoplay. Hartman chooses not to represent the spectacle in order to call attention to the ease with which such scenes are usually reiterated, the casualness with which they are circulated, and the consequence of this routine display of the ravaged body. Rather than inciting indignation, she writes, too often they immure us to pain by virtue of their familiarity. What interests me, she says, are the ways we are called upon to participate in such scenes. Are we witnesses who confirm the truth of what happened in the face of world-destroying capacities of pain? Or are we voyeurs, fascinated with and repelled by exhibitions of terror and sufferance? What does the exposure of the violated body yield? Does the pain of the other merely provide us with the opportunity for self-reflection? At issue here is the precariousness of empathy and the uncertain line between witness and spectator. Hartman chooses instead to look elsewhere, to consider those scenes in the archive of slavery in which terror can hardly be discerned. By defamiliarizing the familiar, she writes, I hope to illuminate the terror of the mundane and quotidian rather than exploit the shocking spectacle. I find a lot of value in this way of thinking. Okay, back to wisdom. The thing Toni Morrison says comes after data, after information, after knowledge. Teju Cole is an artist who traffics in wisdom. From his visual work on Instagram, to his small fates on Twitter, even to his playlist on Spotify, and that is to say nothing of the essays, the literature, the photographs. It seems as if Cole is after a set of questions and their attendant ways of seeing that is never at rest, always in motion, always between time zones, always engaging with the blind spots. He published an essay last year called Death in the Browser tab. There you are, watching another death on video, Cole writes. In the course of ordinary life, at lunch or in bed, in a car or in the park, you are suddenly plunged into someone else's crisis, someone else's horror. It arrives, absurdly, in the midst of banal things. That is how, late one afternoon in April, I watched Walter Scott die. The footage of his death, taken by a passerby, had just been published online on the front page of the New York Times. I watched it, sitting at my desk in Brooklyn, and was stunned by it. He goes on to recount his second and third viewings of the video, in addition to his own journey to North Charleston, the site of Scott's death. In the near distance, just to the left of the paved track that bisected the grass, was a small memorial at the spot where Scott fell. This was not only the scene of a crime, it also made visible things that were not apparent in the video. The last view Scott saw, the exit from the lot, the unnerving quietness of the area, the banality of dying in a side lot off a side street in an unremarkable town. Reading this essay, it occurred to me that these kinds of journeys were possible for every person in that archive, every person whose life was ended by the police that year, every person in the Pulitzer Prize-winning database of dead folk at the Washington Post or at the Guardian, every person who is now a number in a database. How many places would appear to be like that lot, off a side street, in an unremarkable town? If you set enough tangents around a circle, Cole writes, you begin to recreate the shape of the circle itself. What is the shape of the American landscape? Which are the tangents worth walking, and which are the circles better left untraced? Freddie Gray, Betty Jones, Walter Scott, Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Yvette Henderson, Natasha McKenna, Jessica Williams. The list goes on. Using location data from every one of these fatal encounters in 2015, I started assembling a wall of elsewheres, a grid of meaning, the last view someone else may have seen. Teju named it Officer Involved, an immersion in the life, in the environment of someone's last moments. It was a search for a different kind of ghost in the machine. I want to close where I began, with Morrison, and with one final note on hauntings. If the American landscape is ghosted, always already, by its various normative annihilations, how do they appear in our data? What is the role of historical research and historical residues in the contemporary production of art, fiction, and journalism? In describing the role of research in writing Beloved, Toni Morrison has spoken at length about the bit. In reading some of the documents, she says, I noticed frequent references to something that was never properly described, the bit. This thing was put into the mouth of slaves to punish them and shut them up without preventing them from working. I spent a long time trying to find out what it looked like, she says, but I really couldn't image the thing. Did it look like a horse's bit or what? Then I realized, she says, that describing it would never be helpful, that the reader didn't have to see it so much as feel what it felt like. I realized that this was important to imagine the bit as an active instrument, rather than simply as a curio or an historical fact. And in the same way, I wanted to show the reader what slavery felt like, rather than how it looked. I would say that this tracks closely with Morrison's choice not to read too much into the historical record about Margaret Garner, the person. In order to make way for Beloved, both the ghost and the book, it seems Morrison had to work in the garden of wisdom, or as she calls it, the controlled wilderness of narrative fiction. As people who work with data, how might we move from the mode of the visual to the terrain of feeling? How might I allow you to have a relationship with data rather than just give you something to look at? There's a passage, Morrison continues, in which Paul D says to Sethe, I never told anybody about it. I've sung about it sometimes. He tries to tell her what wearing the bit was like, but he ends up talking about a rooster that he swears smiled at him when he wore it. He felt cheapened and lessened, and that he would never be worth as much as a rooster sitting on a tub in the sunlight. Circling around Paul D, Morrison has Sethe continue the tangent, centering in on the circle. And I'll close with this passage. Sethe knew that the circle she was making around the room, him, the subject, would remain one, that she could never close in, pin it down for anybody who had to ask. If they didn't get it right off, she could never explain. Because the truth was simple, not a long, drawn-out record of flowered shifts, tree cages, selfishness, ankle ropes, and wells. Simple. She was squatting in the garden, and when she saw them coming and recognized school teacher's hat, she heard wings. Little hummingbirds stuck their needle beaks right through her headcloth into her hair and beat their wings. And if she thought anything, it was no, 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 no. Simple. She just flew, collected every bit of life she had made, all the parts of her that were precious and fine and beautiful, and carried, pushed, dragged them through the veil, out, away, over there, where no one could hurt them, over there, outside this place, where they would be safe. And the hummingbird wings beat on. Thank you.